Welcome back to the Free Mind Podcast, where we explore topics in Western history, politics, philosophy, literature, and current events, with a laser focus on seeking the truth and an adventurous disregard for ideological and academic fashions. I'm Matt Burgess, an assistant professor of environmental studies and faculty fellow of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. My guest today is Cory Clark. Cory Clark is Executive Director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is also a visiting scholar in the Wharton School and the School of Arts and Sciences. The Adversarial Collaboration Project brings together scholars who have contrasting views on important scientific questions to work out their differences through rigorous collaborations. It is based on the idea that viewpoint diversity produces better science, an idea we strongly believe in at the Benson Center. We discuss this project, as well as Dr. Clark's other work on trust in academia, nuances in gender bias, and more. Cory Clark, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you are the executive director of what I think is one of the coolest projects in academia right now, Penn's Adversarial Collaboration Project. So tell me, what is adversarial collaboration? Why is it necessary? And how is your project facilitating it?
Yeah, so adversarial collaboration is essentially the idea that when scholars disagree with one another, they should get together and figure out what's going on, like figure out the nature of the disagreement. Are they actually disagreeing? And if so, how could they test which of their claims is closer to the truth, or maybe they're both a little bit right in different contexts. The term itself was coined by Danny Kahneman, so that's not my term. But with Phil Tetlock, we're essentially trying to make this be an incredibly normal and typical part of science, where when one scientist realizes they're like publishing work that's contradicting another scientist's work, the first thing they should do is get together and work to figure out what's going on with their disagreement, rather than just pumping contradictory information out into the scientific literature for years or decades, which is what currently happens. And I think that this has potential to expedite scientific progress, because rather than having scholars just, creating tons of information on both sides of controversies and debates that contradicts one another and confuses people about what is true, how can we design effective policy if we don't know what's true? If scholars can figure out why they're having this disagreement and what is really the truth between them, we can, make scientific progress faster. And then my hope is also just that it can sort of change the culture of science, which right now is very competitive and people have a lot of enemies. And if you publish something and someone else contradicts what you publish, you hate that person, they hate you, and you create these little factions of scholars over time that dislike each other because they disagree empirically. I think if people could get together and, become collaborators, it potentially could turn, enemy scientists into sparring partners who help us improve our science, rather than as enemies that we're trying to destroy, or they're trying to destroy us and I have to destroy them first. So that's my hope. We're working to we're supporting adversarial collaborations ourselves. I'm participating in a bunch of them myself. I've also written several articles and chapters and popular press pieces on why we need adversarial collaborations, and trying to persuade scientists that it won't end their career if they participate in one of these. So yeah, making the persuasive case and then also trying to lead by example, I guess, is how we're tackling that one.
Is there an example that you've facilitated through your center that is your favorite and that you're able to share? Obviously, and maybe there's some projects that are early stages that you can't talk about, but what's one that you're really excited about?
Yeah, so one thing is they sort of exist on a continuum. Like some of them are much more like clearly adversarial than other ones. The ones that are less adversarial are a little bit easier. But I wouldn't say I have a favorite. I have two that are hopefully getting close to publishing. And in both cases, they really kind of showed that both sides are a little bit right and a little bit wrong, which I think is the way these are going to tend to go.
Uh-huh.
One is looking at, for example, the rigidity of the right idea, the idea that conservatives are more cognitively rigid than people on the left. But that one's been fun because everyone's been really chill and mellow and getting along well, and people will even argue a little bit against their own side when we're having debates over email. So, yeah, that's been a fun one, and hopefully we'll see. It's going to go on back under review soon.
Nice. What's the other one?
The other one is one we're looking at accuracy nudges and whether they're effective across the political spectrum. And that one too, hopefully, will be published soonish. We'll see.
What's an accuracy nudge? Just for our listeners who don't know.
It's just trying to bring people. Well, there are a bunch of different ones that are used in these studies, but it's essentially are there ways we can get people to care about the accuracy of information they're sharing online? So as a way to potentially deal with misinformation and people sharing misinformation.
So would Twitter saying, "Are you sure you want to post this?" without reading it, would that be an example of an accuracy
That
nudge?
probably would be one, yeah. I don't think that one was included, but that probably would be one, yeah.
Okay, cool.
I don't know if we know if those are effective or not at stopping people from retweeting things they haven't read.
It's interesting that you say that most of these collaborations tend to find that there's truth in both sides. That doesn't surprise me at all, right?
Yeah.
A lot of scholarly debates are about emphasis as much as they're about
Mhm.
facts. In fact, a lot of political debates are about emphasis as much as they're about facts.
That's exactly what we see. It's, okay, we all agree that this effect is there, that it's this size, but how important is it? Or, how big of a deal is it? Is this worth studying more? Is this worth designing interventions to combat? It's not all, I don't want to say it's all that, but a lot of it is not actually even a disagreement over the facts. It's a disagreement over the value of the fact.
Yeah. Or on the emphasis. I mean, one of my favorite examples of an adversarial collaboration that predated your center was, I think, Jonathan Haidt convened a group of Brookings and AEI through Brookings and AEI to talk about poverty, to write a consensus report on poverty,
Okay.
and they brought liberals and conservatives together. And as I remember, the story was that the liberals convinced the conservatives that racism and racial inequality was important, and the conservatives convinced the liberals that family structure and fatherlessness was important. So that's, again, totally an example of an emphasis thing, right? Those are one of the issues that I'm really interested in right now is this debate about whether economic growth can be sustainable. And it's like, on one side, you have people who say it's not biophysically possible to have growth forever. And then the other side, you have people say that growth has been directly responsible for our material progress, which has been incredible, and indirectly responsible in some way for our moral progress, which has also been incredible. I'm like, those aren't mutually exclusive. Let's talk about that. Maybe I'll send you a proposal about that someday. I want to ask you about, to the extent that you can share, trying to recruit people into these adversarial collaborations and what incentives might be at play.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine that there are some disincentives, right? For example, you're worried that your idea is wrong, right? Especially in some of these morally charged fields. It's not just that scientists are worried about their, intellectual legacy not holding up, right? In many cases, they're also worried about their deep moral convictions being undermined. But then there's also, an element of reputation and legacy, and it actually seems like there's a famous example of an adversarial collaboration in fisheries, which I won't bore you with the details of. But in a nutshell, it was really beneficial to the reputations of both sides to do the adversarial collaboration, because they had been, fighting in the press, and the paper that they wrote together, which was published in Science, became, maybe the canonical fisheries paper. And they both, it was a large team of authors, but there were two scientists in particular that were leading it, who had been adversaries. Both gained enormously reputationally. So how have you?
In that one, though, was the outcome one of these kinds where they're both kind of right? It wasn't one of them was devastated and the other one was victorious.
It was a little bit in between. So
Okay.
it was definitely that one side was kind of more right than the other side.
Okay.
But then there was also kind of an emphasis thing where one of the papers is, I guess it's hard without the specifics, but basically one of the papers that sparked the debate made a claim that held up about the fact that fisheries were having damaging effects on ecosystem services in different domains of the ocean. And then it made a claim kind of towards the end that fisheries were on track to all be collapsed by 2050.
Mm,
So the second part of that didn't hold up.
I see.
Uh,
Yeah.
but the second part of that was central to the part of the debate that was hot.
Yeah.
But the first part of that is important and did hold up. And so it's I guess it's kind of in between. Or maybe it is somewhat like your examples. Anyway, tell me about your experience trying to get people to get involved in these things.
So I've been fairly lucky so far in terms of recruiting people, but that might be because of the people that I've been recruiting, like people that I know and people that I personally think would be capable of participating in one of these, and that I think, at least tries to prioritize the truth over just advancing their own careers or a particular political agenda. I do think that they would be really hard for some people, and especially some people who have really tied their reputation to a particular empirical claim, and that they've been working on that claim for, say, 20, 30 years, and that's sort of why they're famous and why people respect them. Those people, I wouldn't, for the most part, expect to be willing to participate in one of these because, as you said, like the risks can be way too high. If it's a case where literally their entire career could be proven wrong, I don't think scholars would want to participate in in that kind of exercise. But this is why I think, you know, it would be better if we can sort of make this like change the cultural norm of adversarial collaborations, get the young people in, the people who still have careers ahead of them where they can find something new or do something different. If I'm disagreeing with a scholar, when I'm an early career researcher and I can get that sorted out now, that actually probably will help my career because I'm going to be doing better science. I'm going to
Right.
not waste my time on a dead end if I am wrong. But if you're already at the end of a dead end, then I don't know. Like, I don't think we could expect those people to. I'm not saying nobody would change their mind at that point, but I think most scholars would be really reluctant to do so. The other thing is they really are more time consuming, and that's a
Right.
problem because scientists, they want to publish as much as fast as possible, and these are not helpful for that. So
It's like you're writing the paper with reviewer two, right?
exactly, it's not even writing the paper, but making every single decision with reviewer 2, which should, and I think it's been true that we do end up developing higher quality methods, because of that process where each side is sort of vetoing the other side's like, no, this is why that's biased. This is why that's biased. This is why, get rid of all of the things that seem skewed in one direction or another and come down to, okay, this is the only thing we can agree on that is a fair way to test this question. So you're getting better methods that way. But it's slower. I mean, even like negotiating words that are included in the abstract or general, I've almost never had that happen in a traditional collaboration where everybody wants to frame things the exact same way. Whereas in adversarial collaboration, so far I've seen it's really quite normal for people to debate over like, can we include this word here or can we change this word? So yeah, that's a problem. I'm trying to incentivize them by I've been providing funding to people. I've been providing my assistance to people. I do think that there's a reputational benefit to participating in them because it creates the impression that you're a scholar who cares more about the truth than just protecting your career,
Totally.
pushing a political agenda. So hopefully that balances things out a little bit. And then my other hope is that if it is true that these produce better science, and the scientific community comes to value them, then they'll also be evaluated more favorably in the peer review process. So, like, I don't know if you've ever conducted a meta-analysis, but it's a huge pain in the ass. Like, it's very time
Yeah.
consuming, and you might get one paper out of that much more laborious process. So I'm thinking if people are willing to do meta-analyses, and the reason they're willing to do them is because they get published in higher tier journals.
That's right.
If
Yep.
the same is true of adversarial collaborations, then that should incentivize people too.
And I hope it is true. And I think it might be true. Is that your hypothesis?
That they probably produce better science?
Well, I'm sure they produce better science, but that much ink has been spilled on the various ways in which the incentives of the academy can be flawed. And yet I still hold out enough, I think, reasonable hope, not kind of Pollyannish hope, like accurate prior hope, that it is the case that there's enough value in adversarial collaborations that they do probably get published. They will probably get published disproportionately in high impact journals. And also, reviewer 2 is friends with somebody on the author team, probably, right?
Yeah. I think I've only been doing this for how long? 2.5 years, maybe. So I've only had a few papers that I've been working on start their way through the peer review process. But I've only seen positive things be said about the fact that they're adversarial collaboration. I haven't seen anyone say, "Oh, we can't trust this. It's an adversarial collaboration." So I do think they're likely to be viewed more favorably. There could be a criticism, and this is one thing I've thought about. Let's say the scientific community really does come to value these, then it will incentivize scholars to pretend to be adversaries when they're really not, and just like take on a project and be like, I predicted X and they predicted Y. Look, we did an adversarial collaboration. But really, they were just, I don't know if that's really a big deal if that did end up happening. But
is it possible that even would be better than the status quo, right? Because it would make people steelman themselves, even if they don't genuinely believe the other side?
Yeah, like even flipping a coin and randomly assigning each person to, okay, you have to defend X and you have to defend not X, go. I do think they probably would end up with fairer methods than what most scientists currently do, which is how can I prove the thing true? And what methods can I design to prove this thing true that I already think is true? So yeah, I do think that probably still would be better, even if it was, a little bit of a misleading frame for how they're doing there.
Here's another thing that I wonder if you've thought or worried about. So people often currently who are paying attention to these issues worry about concessions that are made in writing the paper compared to what the authors think, either to pitch it for the journal or to, negotiate among co-authors or, serve some policy interest. I'm thinking about, we did an episode earlier this semester with Roger Pilkey Jr., who's written a lot about this in the context of COVID origins. Do you ever worry that the adversarial collaboration will work so well sociologically that in a case where one side really is right on the facts, that they kind of water that down to give the other side some dignity?
That's a good question. And yeah, I bet that I can definitely see how that would happen. Because let's say you are doing an adversarial collaboration and you're actually getting along reasonably well and you get the results back. And at this point now, you're friends with your collaborator. They predicted X, you predicted Y, you see Y. Then you probably do have some sympathy for the other person. And you might be like, okay, well, we can say this thing. So that probably could happen. Although I guess as you're kind of point, like, I don't know how different that would be than what goes on now. Because certainly
Right.
I've had to say things in papers that I don't fully agree with or frame things in ways that I wouldn't frame them because of something the editor or a reviewer said.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So one last thing on this general topic of adversarial collaboration is funding. It seems like the incentives are somewhat there, but not entirely there for academics to participate in this. And we talked about the incentives for and against. It seems like if funders got on board with this as a gold standard, and journals get on board with this as a gold standard, that would move the needle enormously. I mean, I'm thinking about like how many NSF grants, say they're going to do workshops in high schools now, right? Because of the broader impacts thing, right? And that's lots of instances where that's a great thing, but that's sort of, it seems like if funders decide collectively that we want a certain thing, academics usually do fall in line.
Yeah. I think that would be huge if a lot of the fund, like we can look at government funding agencies like NSF or NIH or any of those that really are trying to solve specific problems and really therefore do care about the quality of the science that comes out of those projects. They should be more likely to support an adversarial collaboration than to support a scientist who they already know has a particular agenda and wants to find a particular outcome. Same goes for really any of the nonprofits that have particular problems that they're interested in solving. If their mission, if their success at achieving their mission depends on having accurate information, then it would be in their interests to fund adversarial collaborations too. I think potentially one reason you don't see that explicitly mentioned in like calls for funding proposals is just because they're so rare and so few scholars actually do them. It might also deter some people from applying in the first place. So that's maybe a problem too. But if it was just something like, we look favorably upon adversarial collaborations, that would nudge scientists to consider that approach and would help people adopt the model of adversarial collaboration, I think, quicker than would happen if it's just me still trying to persuade people.
Yeah. So let's talk about a specific adversarial collaboration that you didn't facilitate, but that is related to some other things that you've written about. So there's a paper recently that came out by C.C. Williams and Kahn, which was an adversarial collaboration on gender bias in academia. And as I understand it, the gist of what they found was that women are disadvantaged compared to men on average in teaching evaluations and salaries. Men are disadvantaged compared to women in hiring, and it's more or less even elsewhere. First of all, is that a correct representation of that study?
I think I haven't read it for a few months or a couple, whenever it came out. But that sounds right to me. I think generally what they found was that, so they looked across 6 domains, I believe, and whereas a lot of people would say, academia just discriminates against women pretty much across the board, and that's a really popular finding to publish. Um, the picture was much more nuanced, and the differences were much smaller. Like I think, for example, I think there was a salary difference, but it was fairly small, and especially in comparison to the numbers that people often throw around. And then same with the teaching evaluations; those are complicated because if you're actually looking at real teaching evaluations, then there's potentially a real reason why there would be differences there.
Right.
So you really want to be focusing on these experimentally manipulated, like online teaching classes where the students think their teacher's one thing and not the other. So I think the findings were essentially just a little bit more complex and suggest that we can't just be making these broad claims that academia discriminates against women because it depends a lot on what kind of study you're looking at, where you're looking, when you're looking, and which domains we're talking about.
So there was another big study that came out that was not just looking at academia. It was looking across all domains, and found that several decades ago, there was a pro-male bias in male-dominated fields and a pro-female bias in hiring in female-dominated fields. And then the pro-male bias in male-dominated fields shrunk and reversed in around 2010, and has been maybe a small pro-female bias since then. And then also,
I'm a low-level co-author on that one. And actually, the forecasting tournament we did in that one, which was asking scientists and everyday people to predict the results of the meta-analysis, that kind of was born out of the Adversarial Collaboration Project, because we had Greg Mitchell, who was working with us on some other projects, was kind of consulting on that part of that project. So it's not actually an adversarial collaboration, but it kind of was conceived that way. Yeah.
So there's 3 follow-up questions I want to ask you about the findings of these 2 studies. The first is, it strikes me that there's been huge changes in how academia focuses on biases, right? Identity biases. So there's stories coming out about departments and universities basically exclusively doing diversity hiring after 2020, right? I've also heard lots of really bad stories about the sorts of bias that people think is still pervasive, from 30 years ago, right? And occasionally from more recently than that. So when you're doing this kind of a meta-analysis, obviously in the second paper, you were explicitly looking at how things have changed over time. But if you've potentially had, huge changes in the last 5 years, how do you think about getting to the bottom of that?
What do you mean?
Well, so for example, suppose that you had, a bunch of studies from 2010 that said there's lots of subconscious bias that affects various groups, right? And yet, post 2020, there's probably been a lot of conscious bias going the other way.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate that into a meta-analysis?
Yeah. So I think anytime you're looking at something that wouldn't be a stable fact over time, and it's something that's a cultural issue, like something that you would expect to change as culture changes, then you would want to look at the impact of time on your outcome. And so in the case of the one on hiring bias, that's why they looked at the issue over time.
Right.
But a bigger problem, not a bigger problem, but another problem is that there's a lot more science now than there was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and a lot better science now than there was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So it's also kind of hard to make those comparisons because you're comparing, 20, 30, 50 studies that have been conducted in the past 5 years to 3 that were conducted in the
Right.
70s and were really crappy and had small sample sizes. So those things are hard to look at. I do think people often forget that anytime you're looking at a scientific finding it's just like a potential cultural moment, to keep in mind that a study from 2010, if it's a statement about culture in 2010, it's really not all that useful anymore. And when we're having these debates, we need to be thinking about, what does the latest science show? And if we don't know of any science that shows anything in the past 3 years, then someone needs to reconduct these studies.
Right.
Which is what happened with the hiring bias. You can find plenty of studies that show discrimination against women. Those studies are out there. But the question is, how old are they? What domains are they in? And then also, what has happened as a result of knowledge of those studies. So if the whole world thinks we're discriminating against women, they might start discriminating against men to balance things out, and then kind of forget that over time, that's going to change the reality of discrimination. And then and then we find the situation, we're slightly discriminating against men. Do we want to now flip things again to make up for the fact we're discriminating against men? Or can we just get rid of gender as a criterion when we're deciding who to hire?
Treat people as people, and what a shocking concept.
So it's a radical idea.
But okay, my second follow-up question, I think you found in the study that you were a co-author in, that domain experts, were especially bad at anticipating your results. Is that right?
So we found that behavioral scientists were slightly better. Although I should say both everyday people and behavioral scientists radically overestimated gender bias, and in both directions. They thought
interesting.
stereotypical stereotypically male jobs, they thought bias in favor of men would be much larger. I think academics over 5 times and everyday people over 13 times, whereas the effect size was it was 1.4 times, I think, as high. And similarly for stereotypically female jobs, they drastically overestimated how much females are favored. So these actual gender biases are quite small. And in fact, they were always much smaller than scientists today thought they were. Wait, what was
to an economist, that's
okay.
actually not that surprising, right? Because bias, to an economist, that's not surprising because bias has a cost, right? Lots of people have written about this. Thomas Sowell, wrote about this in his recent book. If you're in a field that has a lot of direct reward feedback on merit, which I think some people could argue that academia could use more of, right? That creates a strong economic disincentive against any kind of discrimination, because any kind of discrimination that comes at a cost of merit has a cost to your bottom line, right? And so there should be a strong feedback in any field that's getting substantive material feedback on merit, should have a strong disincentive against bias.
But the question then is, why are behavioral scientists and everyday people so wrong about that? Why do they think things are so much more unfair than they really are?
I don't know. I want to put part of this as a question to you because it touches on some other stuff you've written about. My guess is that part of it, in terms of overestimating all types of bias, just has to do with the fact that people overestimate all types of bad stuff in general, right?
Yeah, that's true.
One of my favorite studies is, the ones that show that people think that their country is in bad shape, but on average they think their neighborhood is in great shape. And it's like, if people weren't biased, they'd have to average. Those two would have to average out to be the same, right?
Right.
And I imagine you see some of that among academics. It's like, well, academia is super biased. Our department isn't so bad, but academia is horrible, right?
Right.
So besides
a lot of
negativity
it
bias,
could just be science too. Is like scientists are so incentivized to exaggerate the importance and significance of their findings. So anytime a scientist finds like a teeny tiny bias against women, they're like, proof sexism. And then we just kind of interpret it as, this is a really big deal, not this is a teeny tiny effect size.
So one other explanation for, half of that misperception finding that's related to something you've written about before, which I think is interesting, is the idea that we might, paradoxically overestimate biases against women because of traditional gender frames that frame women as, unagentic and more easily victimized, and maybe also more needing of empathy and help when they're victimized, right? So I think you've written about this with Bo Weingard. Tanya Reynolds has done some studies on this, I believe. Is that part of the story too? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So there have been really over the past few decades, there have been quite a few studies, even like Alice Eagley, who is kind of, I think, sympathetic to the potential biases against women. She's famous for the women are wonderful effect, which is just like the idea that basically people think women are better than men and like women more than men. And this has been replicated across tons of different contexts. I think what you're talking about, what I have looked at, and also Steve Stewart Williams has looked at similar things, where he has found, and I have found, that people prefer scientific findings that portray women positively and more positively than men, relative to findings that portray men more positively than women. So they really want science to show that women are better than men, and they do not want science to show that men are better than women. And people kind of have this pro-female bias where they care more about women, they care more about harm to women, they care less about harm to men, and women also get punished less harshly for the same kinds of things. So you have all these findings that point to a pro-female bias, and sometimes they're even framed as sexist against women. Like there was this one that found, I'm forgetting the names of the two authors of this paper, but they found that when a person finds out that a piece of writing was written by a woman, they increase their estimates of the quality of the essay or whatever it was, whatever the piece of writing was. And they framed this as like sugar-coated feedback to women. So this was harming women because we're giving women really positive evaluations. And Steve Stewart Williams and some others have argued that this might be a sort of evolutionary thing where we care more about the well-being of women and women's survival matters more.
Male disposability, cheap sperm, expensive eggs, that kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly. But I don't think that's wrong. I think that's probably part of it, and that probably explains things like why we have probably always cared more about harm to women and valued their lives more. We send men to war and women stay home, and the men protect the women. I think it explains stuff like that. I don't know that it explains these findings where people like science that shows women are better than men compared to science that shows men are better than women. Because I just don't think we would have seen this effect like in the 1950s or the 1920s. Like
Oh, interesting.
if a scientific article said women are smarter than men in the 1950s, would people have been biased in favor of that compared to science that says men are smarter than women? I mean, maybe, but I'm
Yeah, it's
certainly
a
not
logical
confident.
hypothesis. It certainly is a
Women were portrayed as like, hysterical and irrational and like
yeah.
I don't know if they were framed as dumb, but they were framed as like incapable of culture and that kind of
My
thing.
hypothesis would also be against that finding being found in the 50s, right? For all the
Right.
reasons that you just said.
Which I think just points to, again, it's something cultural right now that everybody wants everything good to be about women and everything bad is about men.
So that's really interesting. That's a really interesting nuance because so if you put that very recent culture aspect aside, the best explanation, or maybe the most complete explanation I've seen for all the different, how do you reconcile all the findings that find, bias against men in some contexts and women in other contexts, is I think from Tanya Reynolds, basically framing it in this probably Steve Stewart Williams like evolutionary context, basically saying that the unifying feature in gender bias is about agency. That basically people assign men more agency. And so that means if men do something bad, then they get more blame for it. But if they do something good, maybe in some cases they get more credit for it. And maybe they're expected to be, there's more of a default expectation that they're going to be in, very, very high status roles that, are all about having agency. And does that make sense to you as a framework for understanding, for reconciling all these different findings that sometimes seem to be in conflict?
Possibly. I mean, I think there's a relationship between our sort of moral concern for men and women and how we think about agency. I mean, that's using the Kurt Gray framework of like dyadic morality. The more someone's
Right.
like an agent, the less they're a patient, and vice versa. But I'm not sure it has to be that complex because it can be something really quite simple, which is just that we care more about harm to women. And that's as complex as it needs to be. Um, because that means we should want to punish women less harshly when they do bad things because we don't want to harm women. But because when you punish someone, you're harming them. You're creating some kind of costs for them that's putting them at
Right.
risk. So if we just kind of have a general bias where men's lives are more disposable than women's, then I think you kind of can explain all of those sorts of findings. But again, you still fail to explain more recent biases that seem to that favor women even for like agentic type things where
Right.
we think women are smarter, they're better leaders, they're more competent in almost everything. I mean, even things that come like looking at people seem to have biases about wanting women to be as strong or stronger than men and as fast or faster than men, which are all things you might associate with like agency. But now
Right.
we have this pro women bias and it just spreads across everything.
Okay. One last question on this, and then I want to move on to one more topic. So you somewhat critically referred to an example of people framing this bias as sexism against women.
Mm-hmm.
Permit me to annoy you
Okay.
by pulling that thread a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I, without getting into specifics, I know somebody quite well who, when she was in high school, was the head of the robotics club of her high school. Super into STEM. I'm from Canada, and so is this person I know. And then a Canadian woman won the Nobel Prize in Physics a few years ago, Donna Strickland. And so they had this big event for local high school students, I think it was, on women in physics. And this person I know, I think, was expecting to go to something about how awesome women in physics are doing, including this woman who won the Nobel Prize. And what I heard was that the speakers were all about how horrible it is for women in physics and how it's going to be horrible to go into physics if you're a woman. As you can imagine, this person I know who was a very talented woman in physics in high school did not major in physics. I don't know if that's the only reason why, but I do worry also, if you look at some of the mental health statistics you see among, young, particularly liberal women, I do worry that some of this narrative of doom and gloom, even though it's intended to be helpful, right? It's intended to be anti-sexist, is harmful. What are your thoughts on that?
So that's a little bit of a different issue than what I was talking about. I was talking about giving women basically sugar-coated feedback, and
Gotcha.
they're saying that could be harmful to women, which it certainly could be, but it's not clear to me that on whole, if people look at the work of women more favorably than the work of men, even if that is sugarcoating feedback to the woman, on whole, it could help her career. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Right, you
What
could
you're
make both
talking
cases,
about,
yeah.
right? Exactly. What you're talking about, I do think is kind of an interesting. It seems to be a contradiction to me, where people are really trying to, or at least they say they're really trying to get women into STEM and promote women in STEM, but then they portray STEM as this horrible place for women. And I think what they think they're doing is that by like shining a light on how horrible it is, then it will become better for women, and then women will want to go into STEM. But I don't think they think about what you're pointing out, which is if you make it look like STEM is a terrible place for women, you're not going to make women want to go into STEM more. You're going to make them think, why would I go there?
Right.
If everyone's going to be, I'm going to have to work twice as hard, everyone's going to be sexist against me, and like I'm not going to get what I deserve. Yeah, that doesn't sound like the kind of place that a woman would want to be.
It's like subverting the message that you're trying to send. It reminds me of like, I talk about sometimes in the context of climate change, that we sometimes in the context of American climate change activism, we say things like, America is this horrible backward country that's never done anything right. All we've done is, screw over the developing world. But developing world, you should follow us into the climate sunset because we know what to do. And
also, you should be able to live here because it's much better here than where you live.
Right, and and I always imagine, like the leaders of Saudi Arabia be thinking like, well, wait, why?
Yeah. Well, yeah. But actually, to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier with the gender bias, it actually still could be strategically the right thing to do, because if what you care about is, say, advancing women in physics, by accusing physics of being sexist against women, you might be creating pro-female biases within physics by spreading that narrative. And so when women do get into physics, they actually are treated better than men. Unfortunately, if that is actually happening, then the tale becomes a lie. But it's not clear to me that telling the world that physics is sexist against women, that actually could end up helping women in physics, even if it might also deter some women from wanting to participate.
And create emotional harms. That's an interesting nuance.
I'm not sure if that's like, if anyone's explicitly thinking about that, but
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk now, shift gears a little bit. You had a paper that came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very prestigious interdisciplinary journal for our listeners who don't know, looking at censorship of science, censorship by and of scientists, and sometimes of themselves, right? I think the main takeaway, correct me if I'm wrong, was that although there are external pressures for scientists to be censored, right, from both sides, Twitter mobs exist on both sides. The on-the-ground reality is that it's largely scientists doing it to themselves and each other. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know if we could actually like quantify it, but scientists are interacting with other scientists. Scientists kind of control outcomes for other scientists. So peer reviewers are scientists, editors are scientists, people on hiring committees are scientists, people who are giving out awards are scientists. So the people that scientists are trying to impress are their peers.
Right.
And their peers hold the careers of their peers in their hands. And so it creates this kind of community where, being ostracized is hugely costly. So you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to piss people off. And getting status is very rewarding. So what you want to do is you want to like show all of your peers that, you're fighting the good fight and you're on the right side of whatever it is they're trying to do. So you get a lot of self-censorship. Scholars are afraid to speak openly about what they believe is empirically true about the world, which is arguably like what their job is to talk about what's empirically true about the world.
Yeah, what a devastating indictment, right? Of
Yeah, that they can't say what they think is true, because they're afraid of judgment and ostracism from their peers, and they're afraid of paying a huge professional cost if they speak openly about the truth. So that's going on. Then you've got a lot of like we frame this as kind of like a pro-social form of censorship, but you get, peers trying to persuade scholars. And I've had plenty of peers try to tell me not to study certain things and not pursue certain topics because they're trying to give you like friendly advice, like, oh, sure, you
Right.
could do that, but your career will suffer. So don't. So you get a lot of that. And then you have like a little bit more aggressive, which is, if you want to call them like cancellation attacks,
Right,
scholars
right.
trying to get other scholars fired, scholars trying to get their papers retracted, scholars trying to get people booted from panels and presentations and disinviting them from giving a talk.
Right.
So all of that's happening too. But all of that, not all of it, a lot of that too is happening like in the name of like ethics or morality. So it's
Right.
we can't have this scholar talk at our university because the students will be traumatized.
Right.
So it's about protecting other people perceived as vulnerable from the views of particular scientists. And a lot of the time, it's just scientists doing that to other scientists.
And so they're doing it scientists are doing it themselves and each other for a combination of moralistic and careerist reasons. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good summary. Yeah. For protecting other people from harmful scientific findings, or at least findings they think are harmful, and then protecting themselves and their colleagues, their students, from pursuing findings that they think will be socially costly.
So I'll preface this question by saying that obviously cancel culture is real, and I recommend the book The Canceling of the American Mind by Schlott and Lukianoff for anybody who doubts that, right, which I just read. But I also wonder if some of the incentives to toe a particular line or to not rock the boat are somewhat overestimated by academics who are, I think, paradoxically selected often for type A personalities, which tends to correlate with risk aversion. And yet, in the context of a right skewed productivity distribution, there's rewards to risk, right? The way I put it to my own students is I say, you should all decide how controversial or non-controversial is your comfort zone. And I can't tell you what your comfort zone should be, but you should also know that if you want to do paradigm shifting research, you're going to have to break somebody's paradigm. That person is on average going to be powerful and upset, right? And so and if you successfully break a paradigm, you actually still are, I think, pretty handsomely rewarded for it. And so to give a specific example of where I wonder if sometimes, or an example that illustrates where I think sometimes people underestimate the incentives for challenging the narrative, is there was a controversy in climate change recently, where a climate scientist published this paper on wildfire in Nature and then wrote an article in Barry Weiss's outfit, The Free Press, basically saying, I framed the design of this study and the narrative of it to fit the climate narrative because I thought that would help it get into Nature. Now, of course, that Free Press article was a very bold thing to do, right? You can't accuse this person of being too risk averse generally. And this is somebody I respect. But I remember one of the things that I was struck by, even though, certainly I recognized some of the incentives he was talking about, was that a good friend of mine had published a paper in Nature on the same day as his paper came out in Nature that went against a dominant climate narrative. And probably that was the reason it got published in Nature, right? She and her colleagues found that basically there wasn't good evidence that heat waves had disrupted aquatic communities in North America, I think. So, and that was actually also an interesting example of an adversarial collaboration because some of her co-authors had been people who had, who are well known for towing, more publishing papers that are, more alarmist about or maybe more alarmed is kind of the more morally neutral way to put it, more alarmed about climate change and marine heat waves. So can you speak to that? Like, do you think that, like the career of somebody like Jonathan Haidt, right, is maybe an example of this, right? That he's done the stuff that he's probably most known for now is stuff that was a little bit boat rocky, right?
Yeah, well, I would for him specifically, I would say yes and no, but I take your point, and I think maybe we want to draw a distinction between, like making a sort of scientific contribution that might be undermining a framework that had been generally accepted among a lot of your peers. I think that can be helpful to your career. Of course, I mean, making any kind of seemingly novel contribution, if it appears to be a high quality one, of course, is excellent
Right.
for your career, even if you are going to make some enemies. But I would say a lot of the time, those enemies are going to be perhaps few in number, because it's a certain number of scholars that are have their identities tied to any particular framework at a
Right.
given point in time. What I'm talking about more is publishing controversial work that almost nobody in your discipline would like, or even
Right.
that the public would hate. That is where I think the majority of the censorship is coming from. So
Yeah.
in my discussions with psychology professors, they're really timid about race and gender and, transgender identity and any of
Right.
these like hot button issues that you could, if you say the wrong thing, even if you're saying something you think is empirically true, you can lose your job. And not only can you lose your job, you can become such a pariah, you can never get another job ever again. And
Yeah, you'd
maybe
be
you can't even
radioactive.
re-enter society. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like, you're not pissing off 12 Harvard professors, you're pissing off tens of thousands of people, and all of the employers are now afraid to hire you because you're so stigmatized. So, and I'm not saying all scientists are, if every scientist today like wrote down all of their empirical beliefs, I'm not saying all scientists have beliefs that would cause that level of,
Yeah.
but because that's kind of in the back of people's minds, they're not saying even relatively more mundane things. Like, even some scholars would shy away from talking about the fact that hiring biases favor women now over men. Like, I know plenty of peers who would not want to put their name on a paper that said that, because they would be booted from a very large community of people, and then they'd be
Well,
labeled a certain kind of scholar. But
let me dig that into that'll hang on a little bit. So I think you're definitely right that there are some topics that make you instantly radioactive, right? So kind of my favorite illustrative example, because it's hypothetical and not real, is there was a paper that came out in either Science or Science Advances a few years ago that looked at different human populations and to what extent there was evidence of Neanderthal DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that the only population for which there was not evidence of Neanderthal DNA was Africans. And I remember at the time thinking, would they have even submitted the paper if they had found the opposite, right? That would be sort of that paper, came out to large fanfare, and it would have probably been instantly radioactive. So certainly there are. So I guess my first question is about those types of areas that are radioactive. Is how big of a problem is that for science? And to kind of steelman the argument that it's not such a big problem, let's think about public university doing open source bioweapons research, right? I think almost nobody would argue that that's good, right? Even if it slowed down our understanding of bioweapons, right?
Right.
And so it seems like almost you could get almost everybody to agree on at least that case, and therefore exists some line in everybody's mind beyond which some topics should exist. Now I think as a scientist you should never put answers there, but I can philosophically argue that you can put topics there, you can put questions there. So I guess my question is, do you agree with that? And how big of a problem is it, do you think, of kind of the number of topics that we put there? Because I think a couple of these, certainly stuff about there's some stuff about race, gender, transgender, definitely is there in terms of how it's treated. But I think like there's people who have had successful careers questioning gender bias, right? There's the two papers that I've done as a faculty member that have the most citations by far are ones that challenge the use of hot climate scenarios. And there's lots of other examples, I think, of where, there's research that's controversial that kind of wins you some enemies, but also some friends. And you can make a case in many of those examples. And I certainly would include my own career in this so far, knock on wood, that the friends I've won have been more beneficial on average than the enemies that I've won. So what's your take on that?
So I think that is correct, and different scholars kind of choose different paths. So like I talk about like being in the zone of like fashionably controversial, which is where you're controversial enough that you have joined a community of like controversial scholars,
Right.
and you're getting some status and friends there. You get invited to their things, and that's cool. But you're not so controversial that you've been fully booted from mainstream, whatever the mainstream group of scholars you're part of. Like in my case, I suppose it would be social psychologists. I don't think I've ever really said anything all that controversial, but I think I've been mostly booted from the mainstream social psychology world. Maybe not entirely. I still have a lot of friends there, but a lot of people dislike me too. But yeah, as you've said, I've also made a lot of friends, and people respect me in other circles, and that's been good for my career. So there are trade-offs, and as you said, like different scholars might choose different strategies in that environment. How much does the existence of that culture negatively affect science? I think it probably. So I guess we would want to think about what is the other option? Like how could it, if it were the case that scholars all critiqued each other's work, but they didn't try to ruin their careers and their lives and call them names,
Right.
and make them fear for their livelihood. Would that be better? I think it probably would be better. You'd still have what's happening here, where you're more respected as some people and less respected by others, but it wouldn't intimidate what I would call like a sort of like moderate center of people who might side with one side or the other, but they won't speak up. And so it kind of makes it impossible to assess where is the scientific consensus on this issue,
Right.
because 80% of scientists won't comment. So I think that's a problem. But yeah, I think you're right. And you said something else that I wanted to comment on. What was there another part to your question?
Oh, I guess just like it strikes me that there are topics that are controversial that win you friends and enemies and maybe more friends. And then there's topics that absolutely make you radioactive. And I guess what I'm saying is I think you could I could make a reasonable case, or a case that I would find reasonable, on both sides of the question of, is the line between those two drawn too far, one way or the other?
Well, you'd also brought up to the case of a research area that literally could cause the end of humanity
Right,
tomorrow.
bioweapons. Yeah.
Yeah, there I've actually tried to think about, like, is there a place that we can draw the line that makes sense and we can agree to it? And I think one potentially useful place is looking at designing technology or applications of science that can have huge, immediate, and certain impacts on human flourishing. So I would put, if your gain of function research potentially could be there depending on what
Right.
you're trying to do. But when it comes to research that is just trying to explain what already exists in the world, and that isn't forwarding a new technology that is catastrophic, like, is that something that we could all agree, like, if all you're trying to do is provide an explanation for what is already happening out in the world, like, should scientists be allowed to do that even if their explanation makes us cringe?
Well, or to steelman the other side maybe of this argument, I don't think they would say that the problem is that it would make us cringe. I think they would say the problem is that if you're studying why does a certain pattern exist, and it's a pattern that we wish didn't exist, widespread poverty in certain communities, for example. I think the worry is that certain findings, especially if they were not rigorously arrived at, would make us not want to try to solve that problem.
Yeah.
And now I think there's a concern on the other side, which is, Roland Fryer has articulated that if you do, bad science that makes people feel good about that problem, and paints a kind of ideologically cohesive view of that problem, that also doesn't help solve the problem. And I think some of the things we're seeing with learning loss and, crime, illustrate examples of that. But what's your response?
To take like a fashionably controversial problem.
Okay. Yeah.
let's talk about gender bias in STEM. Okay, so like if you say the reason there are not an even number of men and women as physicists is not because women are being discriminated against, but because of differences in abilities and interests, and men and women self-selecting into different areas that they like more, or is it part of their comparative advantage? So that's a conclusion that a lot of people would dislike. It's a conclusion that's only trying to explain what is happening. The fear is, well, if we say that, then we won't try to make STEM 50-50. But there is a sort of value assumption there, which is that we should be trying to make STEM 50-50. And so it kind of becomes this it's just sort of like a political controversy, or like a disagreement of values, where some people think in the ideal world, men and women are like 50-50 everywhere, or at least everywhere desirable. And other people would say, no, it's perfectly fine if they're not 50-50 everywhere desirable. And then what do you do? I don't know. It's like a moral.
But I think I agree with the way you framed that issue, but I think by trying to be fashionably controversial, you've picked an issue where the stakes are too low for you really be able to address my question, right? So
Okay.
so because at worst, what you're talking about, right, the way your case applies to my question is, at worst, we, by describing, say, differences in preferences between men and women that would lead to not have 50-50 outcomes. Suppose that we conclude that and we're wrong and we miss an opportunity to address gender bias. I think at worst, what you're doing is you are shifting people around between different white collar jobs, and maybe they would enjoy one slightly more than the other, but it's not catastrophic for society, right? But what if you're talking about parts of the country? Well,
it could mean that men.
Let me
Okay,
present my comparison, and then you can tell me if women in STEM is more devastating. My comparison example is, suppose you're talking about parts of the country where the fraction of kids that are not performing at grade level is 75% or higher, right? Maybe even higher than 90% in some parts of the country. It is possible to imagine controversial research that leads people to the conclusion that we cannot stop that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that phenomenon, if we can stop it, which people like Roland Fryer, suggested that we can at least ameliorate it, that's devastating, right? That's wiping out entire communities from the workforce. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that we don't. I think we do want to understand the causes of that phenomenon rigorously, so I'm not kind of saying we shouldn't, we should make that phenomenon radioactive, but I do understand where people are coming from who say that we should do so carefully.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. I think it's potentially even a little bit more complicated than that, because I'm not sure. So empirical conclusions can certainly be used to justify different policy attitudes or positions, but I don't think they really often, or maybe ever, not, I don't want to say ever. I don't know if they often necessitate any course of action, and I don't think they tell us that we should stop caring about a problem that most people care about. Like, I think no matter, and I could be wrong about this, like maybe things would be I've looked at this a little bit. I have a paper called Harm Hypervigilance, where I've looked at people, overestimating the potential harms of science. And I think this is kind of where I'm thinking, what I'm thinking about here is that even a type of empirical conclusion that might seem to justify like huge inequalities somewhere, or we might say this is going to be a hard problem to address, or it's going to be a hard problem to address in the ways that we've been trying to address it. I don't think we necessarily have to say, okay, well, now we don't care about this problem anymore, and we shouldn't keep thinking of ways to fix it, even if the approach we'd been taking now no longer seems promising, right? Like,
Okay,
are we
yeah.
forced to give up on a social concern if depending on science, or can we continue to have those concerns? And then we use science to decide, well, where do we put our money and where do we put our time to address this problem?
I think that makes sense in the abstract. I think you could still argue as a steelman in the specific case where the solution that you would do and then move away from potentially is helping people learn and build human capital. I think you could still make an argument, but we could have a whole podcast on this. I want to move on really quickly to
I do want to say, I also am a little bit sympathetic to your point as well, because sometimes when I talk about things related to gender bias, you'll get someone on Twitter be like, women shouldn't be allowed to vote anymore. And so it's like someone is drawing that conclusion, right? But usually those people have no power and no one cares about them. So it's like, I'm not so worried about those extreme things happening.
Right.
Some people are.
Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about was you had another paper where you found that if people saw scientists as politicized, as, trying to serve an agenda more than find the truth, that even people who shared their politics trusted science less. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we looked at, in the first, or in two of the studies, we looked at 40 different organizations and institutions and groups of professionals. And then in another one, we looked at 30 different scientific disciplines. And we looked at whether, we did look at whether people perceive the people in that institution as leaning to the left or right. So for example, in psychology, you'd say psychologists are overwhelmingly left-leaning. People perceive them that way, and that is also literally true. But not looking at that, but instead looking at whether people perceive political values as impacting the work that they do. And pretty much across the board, we see these strong negative relationships where the more people perceive political values as influencing work, the less they trust organizations, institutions, groups of professionals, and scientific disciplines. And we did this experimentally as well, where we actually took something kind of similar to what the journal Nature did with its endorsement of Joe Biden. We did this with an organization, and then we also we made up a professional society called Economics Professors of America, and they invited a political speaker to speak at their annual conference. And when we have these organizations or these groups of scientists get involved in politics in some way, or seeming to make some sort of political endorsement, people trust them less, they support them less, they don't want to give them money. But this happens on both the left and the right. So even if Economics Professors of America are inviting a Democratic governor to come speak at their conference, even Democrats trust them less. And same thing goes for people on the right. So we're trying to conduct follow-up research on this question, because if this is true, that literally nobody likes when anyone gets involved in politics, and it's really costly, it's really socially costly, then why do people still do it? And why do organizations still do it all the time?
I have a hypothesis for what the answer to that is.
Good.
My colleague Roger Pilkey Jr. and I wrote a Heterodox Academy blog post, I think shortly before your paper came out, basically argued, that we shouldn't politicize, but our hypothesis was that the two reasons, and hypothesis based on conversations and things we've written, or read, sorry, not written. So I'm pretty confident that I'm understanding the mindset of at least some of the people who are doing this, is that either people think that science has this trusted position in society, and so we should use that to advance what we think is the right political ends. And I think that your study speaks to, or I wish I'd known about it and been able to cite it, actually, because we basically say, that view is naive in that it takes the trust as given and not as conditional on us being honest brokers, on being honest arbiters and seekers of the facts. And then what we also argued was that not being honest arbiters of the facts is actually often harmful to the very political ends that people politicize science in service of, right? So, the devastating effects of defund the police movement on crime and long-term lockdowns on, learning loss, again, especially in disadvantaged communities, maybe even the effects on mental health of liberals, particularly women, caused by the calling of the American mind kind of stuff. We use as examples. So do you have any research that, first of all, what do you think about that? Is that a cohesive explanation, or is it missing something? And what does your research suggest?
Well, I don't know if it is true that these political maneuvers are socially costly, and a lot of organizations and institutions and groups of professionals are really paying attention to trust towards their institution. Like if you look at an organization, like a commercial organization, they're literally like keeping track of data all the time. They
Right.
they should see. I mean, like you can give the Budweiser example, but most of the time it wouldn't be something that had that kind of national coverage. They should be paying attention to, oh, well, we did this and this was the outcome, or that we saw this outcome. What could possibly explain it? Oh, we did that really political advertisement. Maybe that had something. So this is I feel like I must be missing something, because if there are social costs, then people should be aware of those social costs. And then you would think they wouldn't do it anymore. But the fact that it seems to me like a lot of science organizations like journals and professional societies, if anything, are becoming more political over time. So it would have to be, I think, the case that there's actually a benefit,
Yeah,
right?
I have a hypothesis for what the incentives are there, which is that it's short-term gain and long-term costs, right? So and local, right? So your local incentives in science are to be liked by your peers.
Mhm.
Your long-term incentive is to at least be trusted by society who funds you, right?
Right. Yeah,
um,
there's the
and so
iron
there's a
law of
tension between these.
institutions.
Exactly
Yeah,
right. That's a great that's exactly right. And so
but
I
I don't
think
know, like I don't know for so the iron law of institutions is just essentially that people care more about their own status within their
right.
group than they do about the success of their group. So like if you're the leader of Coca-Cola or something, you care about being the big dog in Coca-Cola, but you don't necessarily care if Coca-Cola is around 50 years from now and you're dead and you're not affected by their success
And so I
anymore.
think that issue exists especially in an especially pronounced way in academia, because Coca-Cola and Bud Light can have pretty instant feedback if they piss the public off, right? We can't really. Like
Right.
we've been pissing the public off in a huge way for 10 years, right?
And we will
Uh,
continue to
and we will probably continue to. And
yeah.
eventually that is going to come back to get us, but it's
Well,
it's a
we
much
will piss
slower
them off no
slower
matter
feedback.
what.
Yeah.
But the trust issue, it does seem like the trust has been decreasing over time. And I mean, some of that might just be the fact that we're like interacting with people on Twitter these days where we weren't like 20, 30 years ago. But
Yeah.
if organizations are getting like, so for example, I'm part of SPSP, or not anymore, but it's a big professional
Yeah.
society in social psychology. And they've done various things, like they considered moving the conference because of Roe v. Wade, because the conference was
Yep.
in Georgia. So they're clearly like saying we disagree with the Supreme Court decision. Some members, I believe, called on them to do that. So they're
Yep. I think that's
reacting
right.
to a subset. Do they get feedback and know, the majority of our members, even though some of our members wanted us to move the conference because of, Georgia might not have abortion when the conference is held. Do they get feedback and know, well, the majority of our members don't really care because they don't see abortion as central to our mission, like we're supposed to be doing social psychology or something?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Like, and then maybe the president served these limited terms, so maybe they really don't think more than a year or two or three ahead into the future.
I think
So
self-censorship is definitely part of it. The people in preference falsification, the people, I definitely
mhm.
have seen cases where people, leaders in academic units or institutions, have made decisions that they thought were popular within their institution, but were not, because of the
Right.
few loud voices. Okay, I have time to ask you one more question, and
Okay.
so here's what I'm gonna do to bring it all back in. You run this adversarial collaboration center. You've written about challenges in politicization and trust in academia and political diversity or lack thereof. How do you build an adversarial collaboration in an area where there's so little viewpoint diversity that you can't even find the person who would be on one side of it.
Well, this actually will tie kind of everything we've been talking about together, because
Good.
I think you don't necessarily need, for example, a full-blown conservative to participate in adversarial collaboration, because, as you noted, scholars are incentivized to disagree with other scholars. So when there are, famous models or frameworks or other scientists in the discipline, they get rewarded if they challenge those scholars and those frameworks. And so even if you can't find someone who's going to disagree wholeheartedly across the board with what the majority of people in a discipline think, you will get what I've called in the past one-issue renegades. So these are people who will challenge just one thing.
Right.
Like, they agree 99%, but on this one thing, they're the person who's challenging other people. And so long as for every single issue where there is still a debate happening, you have a handful of people who are willing to tackle that issue from the, heterodox perspective, if you want to call it that, then you can do an adversarial collaboration. And then in the context of the adversarial collaboration, now you have a more level playing field, because it's just like one or two people here and one or two people here. And I think you potentially would have more power to change minds that way, even if you're in a very, very, very small minority.
Well, that's a great hopeful note to end on. So,
I'm not sure if it's true in practice, but it's theoretically.
Yeah. Well, Cory Clark, thanks so much for coming on the Free Mind podcast. I wish you all the best of luck with your adversarial collaboration project, and I encourage our listeners to follow that project closely, because I think it's going to produce some really exciting science in the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. This was fun.
The Free Mind podcast is produced by the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can email us feedback at freemind@colorado.edu or visit us online at colorado.edu/center/Benson. You can also find us on social media. Our Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube accounts are all at Benson Center. Our Instagram is at The Benson Center, and the Facebook is at Bruce D. Benson Center.